November 7th, 1849, Savannah, Georgia. A young, pregnant, enslaved woman stands barefoot on an auction platform in the public market. Her dress hangs loosely from her frame. The skin around her wrists is raw where rope has rubbed it during the journey. The auctioneer unfolds a sheet of paper and clears his throat. Minimum bid, 19 cents. Not $19. 19 cents. A ripple of confusion spreads through the crowd. Men glance at one another. In the slave markets of the South, price always tells a story, and a healthy woman of childbearing age being offered for less than the cost of a cup of coffee can only mean one thing. Something must be very wrong with her. They assume she is diseased, broken, dangerous. No one steps forward to bid. For a long moment, the auction stalls in uncomfortable silence. Then, from the back of the crowd, a stranger raises his hand. $10. Heads turn. No one recognizes him. Before the auctioneer can respond, a local plantation owner snaps, $50. Now the crowd is wide awake. The bidding rises fast. 100, 200, 500. Voices grow louder, faces grow tense. This is no longer an auction. It is a contest. By the time the price passes $1,000, people are no longer whispering. They are staring at the woman, trying to understand what they are missing. Why would two grown men fight over someone who was just offered for 19 cents? What they do not know is that this woman was never supposed to be bought at all. She was supposed to fall into the hands of a plantation owner whose pregnant slaves had a habit of disappearing. And the stranger, who just paid $1,200 for her, knows exactly what waits for her there. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the stories history tried to hide. November 7th, 1849, Savannah, Georgia. The morning air in the public market was already warm, heavy with the smell of salt water drifting in from the river and the faint sweetness of tobacco smoke curling through the crowd. Vendors had cleared space in the center square where auctions were held 3 times a week. Furniture had already been sold. A pair of horses had changed hands. Chickens squawked in a crate near the edge of the platform. Now, it was time for the part of the auction that always drew the largest crowd. Human beings. Men in broad-brimmed hats stood shoulder to shoulder. Some were serious buyers, plantation owners, merchants, traders. Others were spectators who came for the spectacle, who treated the sale of people as entertainment no different from watching livestock sold at market. On the wooden platform stood a young woman. She was barefoot. Her dress hung loosely from her thin frame. The fabric had once been a faded blue, but had long ago surrendered to the color of dust and sun. Her wrists were red and raw where rope had rubbed the skin during transport. One hand rested unconsciously on the gentle curve of her stomach. She was visibly pregnant. She could not have been older than 22. Her eyes did not scan the crowd. She did not plead. She did not cry. She stood very still, as though stillness were the only control she had left. Beside her stood the auctioneer, a man named Cyrus Feldman, known throughout Savannah for his strong voice and efficient manner. He unfolded a sheet of paper and cleared his throat. The murmur of the crowd died down. "Next for sale," he called out. "Female, approximately 22 years of age, experienced in domestic service, able to cook, clean, and manage household duties." He paused and glanced at the paper again, as if unsure he had read it correctly the first time. Then he said the words that would be repeated across Savannah for weeks. Minimum bid, 19 cents. For a moment, no one reacted. The number seemed to hang in the air, detached from meaning. Then a ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. A few men shook their heads. Others leaned toward each other, whispering. Did he say cents? Must be a mistake. Something's wrong with her. Because in the slave markets of the South, price always told a story. A healthy woman of childbearing age, especially one already pregnant, was valuable property. $700, $800, sometimes more. Her labor was useful. Her ability to produce children meant future property for the owner. But 19 cents? That was not a price. That was an insult. That was a warning. Feldman raised his hand to quiet the murmuring. The minimum bid is not a misprint, he said carefully. The seller has requested this starting amount. I am informed the woman is in good health. The price reflects a personal matter between the seller and the property. That explanation satisfied no one. Men stared harder now. They looked for signs, discoloration of the skin, signs of illness, madness in the eyes, anything that would justify such a humiliating price. They saw nothing. She looked tired, frightened perhaps, but not diseased, not broken, which made it worse. No one stepped forward to bid. Seconds stretched into an uncomfortable silence. Feldman shifted his weight. Do I have 19 cents? He called out. Nothing. Men looked away. Some chuckled nervously. Others simply folded their arms. Because no rational buyer wanted to be the fool who purchased a human being so obviously marked as trouble. Then, from the back of the crowd, a calm voice spoke. $10. Heads turn as one. The voice belonged to a man no one recognized. He stood near the edge of the square, tall, thin, dressed in travel-worn clothes. His hat cast a shadow over his face, but there was something steady about the way he stood, something that suggested he was very sure of himself. Feldman blinked. $10, he repeated. The crowd shifted. Confusion turned into alert curiosity. Who bids $10 on a woman no one wants for 19 cents? Before Feldman could call the bid, another voice cut sharply through the air. 50. This voice came from near the front. The speaker stepped forward into clear view, and several men immediately recognized him. Thornton Graves, a plantation owner from outside Savannah. Wealthy, powerful, known for running his land with a kind of cold efficiency that made even other slaveholders uncomfortable. Graves stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, his eyes locked on the stranger at the back. Feldman looked from one man to the other. $50, he called out. The stranger did not hesitate. 100. The murmuring began again, louder now. This was no longer an awkward sale. This was something else entirely. Graves stepped forward another pace. 200. The stranger answered almost immediately. 3. The crowd was no longer whispering. They were staring at the woman on the platform, then back at the two men, trying to understand what they were missing. What did these men see that they did not? Because this was not bidding out of charity. This was not kindness. This was competition. 400, Graves snapped. 5, the stranger replied, his voice calm, almost bored. Feldman's face had lost its professional composure. He had conducted hundreds of auctions. He had seen people sold for high prices before. but never like this. Never starting from 19 cents. 600, Graves said, louder now. 7, 8, 9. The numbers climbed with terrifying speed. Sweat beaded on Graves' forehead. His jaw tightened. He was no longer smiling. The stranger remained still, almost relaxed, as though this were exactly what he had expected. When Graves shouted, 1,000! A gasp moved through the crowd. $1,000 for a woman no one would touch at 19 cents. Feldman looked at the stranger, almost pleading. The man lifted his chin slightly. 1,200. Silence fell so suddenly, it felt like the air had been sucked from the square. No one spoke. No one moved. $1,200. It was an absurd amount, far above her market value, far beyond reason. Graves stared at the stranger for a long moment. Something unreadable passed across his face. Anger, yes, but also calculation. Then, slowly, he stepped back. Feldman swallowed. 1,200 once, 1,200 twice. Sold. A strange mix of excitement and unease moved through the crowd. People talked loudly now, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. The stranger stepped forward to the platform. He removed his hat, revealing a face lined with old scars along the cheek, eyes pale and steady. He placed a heavy leather pouch on the podium and began counting out gold coins. One by one. Graves did not leave. He watched the entire transaction, his face dark with humiliation. When the paperwork was complete and the rope around the woman's wrists was handed to the stranger, Graves moved to intercept him. "You have made a poor investment," Graves said quietly. "Perhaps," the stranger replied. "New to Savannah?" "Yes." Graves nodded slowly. "Then you do not yet understand how things work here." The stranger met his gaze without flinching. "Then perhaps you should have bid higher." The tension between the two men was sharp enough to feel. Finally, Graves stepped aside. "Enjoy your purchase," he said. But the way he said it made the words sound like a threat. The stranger led the woman off the platform and through the crowd. People parted for them, watching, whispering. Behind them, Graves stood perfectly still, staring after them with an expression that promised this was not finished. And the woman, who moments ago had been worth 19 cents in the eyes of the man who owned her, now belonged to someone who had paid $1,200 to keep her away from a man who very clearly wanted her. What no one in that crowd understood, what none of them could possibly guess, was that she had not been priced at 19 cents because she was worthless. She had been priced at 19 cents because someone wanted to make sure she fell into the hands of a monster. She had a name, but on the paper Cyrus Feldman held that morning, she was not listed as a person with a history, a mother, a past. She was listed as female, age approximately 22, domestic, pregnant. Her name, written in faint ink near the top of the bill of sale, read Diner, spelled differently than it had been spelled before, spelled differently than it would be spelled later. Because names did not matter much when you were property. Names changed with owners. Records changed with convenience. A person could be rewritten as easily as a number in a ledger. Diner had been born in 1827 on a rice plantation outside Charleston. She never knew her father. Her mother, Patience, worked in the fields from sunrise until long after dark, her hands permanently stained from rice stalks, her back bent before she turned 30. Patience used to hum soft songs at night, songs passed down from women before her, songs that spoke of places Dinah had never seen but somehow felt she knew. Patience died when Dinah was 11. She did not die suddenly. She wore out. One day she simply did not get up. And 2 days later, Dinah was sold. She was taken from the rice fields and delivered to the city, to a large home owned by a tobacco merchant named Elias Cartwright. On paper, Elias Cartwright was a respectable man. He was 43 years old, married, father of 4 children, a deacon at church, a member of the Charleston Chamber of Commerce, a man whose neighbors described him as disciplined, orderly, and God-fearing. He needed domestic help. Dinah, small and quiet and already trained to obey, was placed inside his household to cook, clean, and care for his younger children. For 3 years, she did exactly what she was told. She learned the layout of the house. She learned when to move silently. She learned when not to make eye contact. She learned the difference between a normal day and a dangerous one by the sound of footsteps in the hallway, and she learned to recognize the way Elias Cartwright watched her. At first it was only a lingering gaze, a pause too long in the doorway, a presence behind her in rooms where he had no business being. Dinah had seen that look before. She had been warned. That look meant her path was about to become much darker. She was only 14 the first time he exerted his control. There was no conversation, no explanation, and no mercy. Under the laws of South Carolina, she was not viewed as a soul to be respected, but as property, and property was granted no voice to decline. What followed became a grim routine, a pattern of unwanted shadows in the servants' quarters after dark. Elias would leave before dawn, and Dinah would return to her work as though her world hadn't been shattered. Legally, in the eyes of the state, nothing had occurred. His wife, Constance, was not blind. She saw the way Dinah's body changed, a truth that made denial impossible. But Constance did not hold her husband to account. Instead, she directed her venom at Dinah. She spoke of temptation and blamed the child who had no power, shielding the man who held all of it. In March of 1843, Dinah gave birth to a daughter named Ruth. The child's features were a mirror of Elias Cartwright, fueling the whispers of neighbors. Yet Elias refused to claim her. In his ledger he simply noted, "Offspring of servant Dinah, lineage unconfirmed." By 1847, the resemblance became a burden to his reputation. One Tuesday morning, without a word of warning, he disposed of his own blood. Dinah heard the screams from the kitchen, a child's voice reaching out for her. By the time she reached the street, the wagon was moving. Small hands reached back, but the distance only grew. Dinah collapsed where she stood. Grief was a luxury the enslaved could not keep. Within days, she was back in that kitchen, forced to serve the man who had stolen her peace and sold her child. 2 years later, when Dinah found herself expecting once more, the illusion shattered. Constance's rage turned into an ultimatum. She would no longer tolerate the living evidence of her husband's transgressions under her roof. Fearing for his social standing in Charleston, Elias arranged a transaction. He contacted a merchant in Savannah to take Dinah away forever, but he added one final, calculated cruelty. He set her price at 19 cents. It was a deliberate message meant to crush her spirit. To him, she was worth less than the dirt beneath her boots, and more importantly, it was a signal to buyers. This property comes with a problem. And Elias knew exactly what kind of man would be attracted to a problem sold for 19 cents. A man named Thornton Graves. Elias Cartwright and Thornton Graves had met years earlier through business dealings. They were not friends, but they understood each other. Elias knew Graves had a reputation, a quiet one, a whispered one. Graves had a pattern. He bought pregnant, enslaved women at suspiciously low prices, and within months, they disappeared. Reported as dying in childbirth, reported as running away, but never seen again. Elias knew this, and he knew Graves watched auctions for opportunities like this. A pregnant woman marked as trouble, priced so low no decent buyer would touch her. Exactly the kind of purchase Graves preferred. Elias did not send Dinah to Savannah to be sold. He sent her to Savannah to be acquired, to be delivered quietly and legally into the hands of a man who would make sure she never returned to Charleston. Never embarrassed him, never told anyone what he had done. 19 cents was not humiliation. It was a death sentence disguised as an auction price. And Elias Cartwright signed the bill of sale with the same pen he used to sign church documents and business contracts. Calmly, neatly, as if he were transferring furniture. He did not send her to Savannah to be sold. He sent her there to die. The wagon did not stop when they left the city. The stranger, who had paid $1,200 without hesitation, drove with quiet urgency, guiding the horse away from Savannah's main roads and into narrower paths that seemed to exist more for animals than for travelers. Pine trees closed in around them. The air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. Sunlight filtered down in thin, dusty beams through the canopy above. The woman, Dinah, sat in the back of the wagon, her hands no longer bound, but her fear still very much intact. She had not spoken since they left the auction. Men had said kind things to her before. Men had made promises before. Words meant nothing. Finally, after nearly an hour of winding through the woods, the wagon entered a clearing. A small cabin stood in the center, made of rough-cut logs, its roof sagging slightly from age. Smoke rose from a stone chimney. The stranger stopped the wagon and climbed down. Before he could knock, the cabin door opened. An older black woman stepped out. Her hair was wrapped in blue cloth, her eyes sharp and searching. "You got her," she said. "I did," the stranger replied. She looked past him to Dinah. Her expression softened. "Come inside, child." The cabin was larger than it appeared from outside. A fire burned in the hearth. The room smelled of beans and salt pork. A younger woman sat at a wooden table, mending a shirt. She looked up and froze when she saw Dinah. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "She's just a girl." "My name is Sarah," the older woman said gently. "This is my daughter, Hannah. You are safe here." Safe. That word again. Dinah wanted to believe it. She truly did. But safety was something enslaved people learned not to trust. She sat down slowly. Her body felt heavy with exhaustion, with confusion, with the strange shock of being treated like a person rather than property. The stranger removed his hat. "My name is Jacob Marsh," he said, "and I need you to listen very carefully." Dinah looked at him without speaking. "I know about Elias Cartwright," he continued. "I know what he did to you. I know about your daughter. I know why you were sent to Savannah." That made her eyes widen. "How?" she whispered. "Because someone in Charleston sent word ahead of you. A woman named Bethy. She works in Cartwright's household. She has connections to people who help enslaved people escape." Dinah felt her breath catch. "The Underground Railroad," Hannah said quietly from the table. Diner had heard the name before, in whispers between enslaved people at night. A rumor, a story, something that sounded too dangerous, too impossible to be real. "It's real," Marsh said. "And you are part of it now." Sarah moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. She opened it and removed a leather-bound journal. The edges of the pages were yellowed with age. "This," she said, placing it on the table, "belonged to a woman named Abigail. She worked on Thornton Graves' plantation." Diner's stomach tightened at the name. Sarah opened the journal and turned it toward her. "Read." The handwriting was neat, careful, as though the writer knew she was recording something important. The first entry Diner saw was dated March 1845. "Today they brought another one. Her name is Rachel. She is pregnant. Mr. Graves keeps her in the old tobacco barn at the edge of the north field. None of us are allowed near it. But at night, I hear her crying." Diner turned the page. "Rachel is gone. They say she died in childbirth, but I heard the baby crying 2 nights ago. And then I heard it stop." Another entry. "A new one now. Margaret. Same as before. Pregnant. Bought cheap. Kept in the barn. Mr. Graves goes there every night." Diner's hands began to shake. "Keep reading," Sarah said. "Margaret disappeared. They say she ran away, but she was 8 months pregnant. She could barely walk." Page after page told the same story. Different names, same pattern. Pregnant women bought for suspiciously low prices, kept isolated in the barn, never seen again. Sometimes a baby's cry heard in the night. Then silence. Hannah spoke quietly. "In 10 years, we know of at least 7 women." Diner looked up slowly. "7?" Sarah nodded. "7 that we can confirm. There may be more." "What does he do to them?" Diner asked, her voice barely audible. Sarah shook her head. "We don't know exactly, but we know enough." Marsh stepped closer. "Thornton Graves is not just a plantation owner," he said. "He's also a slave catcher. He hunts fugitives. He knows the woods, he knows the roads, he knows the people, and he has friends in every county between Savannah and Charleston." Diner thought about the way Graves had stared at her in the auction house, the way his voice had carried anger, not disappointment. He had wanted her, very badly. "Elias Cartwright knew this," Marsh said. "He set your price at 19 cents because he knew Graves watches auctions for exactly this kind of opportunity. A pregnant woman marked as trouble, priced so low no decent buyer would touch her." Diner felt cold all over. "He didn't send you to be sold," Sarah said softly. "He sent you to be delivered." Silence filled the cabin. The fire popped in the hearth. Diner imagined the barn, dark, isolated, far from the main house, a place where no one would hear screaming, where no one would ask questions. She imagined Rachel, Margaret, the unnamed women before them. She imagined their babies. "Why would anyone do this?" she whispered. "Because the law allowed it," Hannah said. "Because enslaved people are not considered people. Because no one investigates when property disappears." Marsh looked at Diner carefully. "When I outbid Graves today, I didn't just embarrass him. I ruined a plan that had been set in motion for weeks. He will want to know why. He will investigate. And if he discovers I am connected to the Underground Railroad. He did not finish the sentence. Sarah did. If Graves finds this cabin, if he learns what we are doing, we will all hang. Dinah looked from one face to another. These people were risking their lives for her, a woman they had never met, a woman who, on paper, was worth 19 cents. She had never felt more terrified, and never more aware that what had happened at the auction was not an accident. It was a rescue. A rescue from something far worse than slavery itself. Because what Thornton Graves did in that barn was not labor. It was not ownership. It was something darker. Something no law bothered to define. Marsh leaned forward slightly. We cannot stay here long. Graves will start asking questions tomorrow. We must move you north before he understands what happened. Denaire nodded slowly. Her mind replayed one thought over and over. If Graves had won that bidding war, she would already be in that barn, and no one would ever have known what happened to her. If Graves discovers this, Sarah said quietly, both of you die. They left the cabin after nightfall. No lanterns, no talking, no wasted movement. Jacob Marsh covered Denaire with a canvas sheet in the back of the wagon as though she were nothing more than supplies being hauled through the woods. The wheels rolled softly over dirt paths that avoided the main roads where riders might be watching. The forest felt different at night. Louder, closer. Every snapping twig sounded like pursuit. Denaire lay on her side beneath the canvas, one hand pressed against her stomach, feeling the child move. She had never traveled like this before, hidden, silent, afraid to even breathe too loudly. Hours passed before the smell of salt water reached her. Savannah's waterfront. Marsh stopped the wagon beside a dark warehouse near the far end of the wharf. Dock workers were still moving about in the distance, loading crates onto ships preparing for dawn departures. A man stepped out from the shadows. Tall, lean, face carved by wind and years at sea. You're late, the man said quietly. Graves is already asking questions, Marsh replied. We can't waste time. The man nodded and turned to Denaire. I'm Captain Porter, he said, and you're coming with me. They moved quickly through the warehouse and out onto the dock. The ship waiting there was a three-masted merchant vessel, old but sturdy, its hull dark with weather and age. A plank connected it to the dock. Denaire had never been on a ship before. She had never seen the ocean up close. Now she was being led onto one in the middle of the night, trusting her life to strangers whose names she barely knew. Below deck the air changed, thick, damp, heavy with the smell of rope, wood, and something faintly rotten. Porter led them to the cargo hold. Crates were stacked high, barrels tied down with rope. At the far end, Porter pulled several crates aside, revealing a narrow gap between them and the hull of the ship. This is where you'll stay, he said. The space was barely 5 feet long and 3 feet wide. I'll bring you food and water twice a day. You cannot make noise. You cannot move the crates. If the crew finds you, I cannot protect you. Denaire looked at the space. Then she nodded. Because she understood something very clearly now. Anything was better than the barn. She climbed inside. Porter pushed the crates back into place, sealing her in darkness. For the first time since leaving Charleston, she was completely alone. The ship left at dawn. She felt it through the wood beneath her. The shift in motion, the slow, rocking rhythm as the vessel pulled away from the dock. Georgia was behind her. For 2 days, the journey was quiet. Porter came as promised, sliding bread and dried meat through a small gap, handing her water in a tin cup. He spoke little, only asking if she was managing. She was not managing. Her body ached from the cramped position. Her legs tingled from lack of movement. The child pressed against her ribs in uncomfortable ways she could not adjust for. But she endured, because endurance was something she knew well. On the 3rd day, the weather changed. She heard it before she felt it. Thunder rolling across the sky, wind rising, the creaking of the ship growing louder. Then the rocking turned violent. Crates shifted, barrels rolled. The ship groaned as though it were alive and in pain. Daenerys pressed herself into the corner of her hiding place, arms wrapped around her stomach, praying the crates would not collapse and crush her. Water crashed against the hull. Lightning cracked overhead. The air inside the cargo hold felt thin, hard to breathe. She thought she would die there. Not in the barn, not in chains, but in a dark box beneath a ship, swallowed by the ocean. The storm lasted all night. When morning came, the motion had calmed. She waited for Porter. He did not come. Morning turned to afternoon, afternoon turned to night. No food, no water, no footsteps. On the 2nd day without provisions, fear became panic. Had he been discovered? Had the crew found out about her? Had something happened to him during the storm? By the 3rd day, her throat burned. Her lips were cracked. The baby moved less. She began to believe this was how she would die. Then she heard footsteps. The crates shifted and blinding light poured in. A young man's face appeared. Red hair, weathered skin, wide eyes. "Sweet Lord," he whispered, "you're real." He lifted a canteen to her lips. "Small sips," he said. "You'll make yourself sick." She drank. "Where is Captain Porter?" she asked. The young man's expression changed. "He's dead," he said quietly. "Fell during the storm. Broke his neck. Before he died, he told me about you, told me where you were, told me to keep you alive until we reach Wilmington." Wilmington. The word sounded like something distant and unreal. "My name's Michael," he said, "and I'm going to help you." He brought food, cheese, hard biscuits, water. Then he hid her again. The ship reached Wilmington the following afternoon. Michael returned with another man, older, calm, eyes that held no fear. "You are Denis," he said. "I am Thomas Garrett. I've been waiting for you." She tried to stand, but her legs failed her. They carried her up the ladder and onto the deck. Sunlight hit her face, and she had to squint through tears. She was looking at free soil for the first time in her life. "Can you walk?" Garrett asked. She nodded, though she could barely feel her feet. A wagon waited at the dock. "There are still men here who would return you south for money," Garrett said. "We travel tonight." From Wilmington, the journey became something entirely different. No more ships, no more hiding in crates. Now it was moving at night through forests and farms, passing from one house to another, one stranger to the next. People who opened their doors without question, who offered food, warm beds, silence. Each of them risking prison or worse for helping her. Weeks passed. Her body grew heavier with pregnancy, her steps slower. Outside Philadelphia, she stayed with a Quaker family who gave her warm clothes and boots. In Rochester, Garrett took her to meet a man whose name she had heard whispered even in slavery: Frederick Douglass. He sat with her at a wooden table and listened as she told him everything. When she finished, he said only one thing: "You must live long enough to tell this story." She carried that sentence with her for the rest of the journey. By late January of 1850, she stood at the edge of a frozen river marking the border. On the other side was Canada. Garrett walked beside her. When her foot touched the opposite bank, she fell to her knees. Not from weakness, from the overwhelming realization that no one could own her anymore. 3 weeks later, she gave birth to a son in a small settlement of former enslaved people. The labor lasted 18 hours. When the child finally cried out, she held him against her chest and felt something she had not felt in years: hope. "What will you name him?" the midwife asked. Denis did not hesitate. "Jacob," she said. After the stranger who paid $1,200 to keep her out of a barn. Years passed. Denina built a life in Canada that would have been unimaginable to the girl who once stood barefoot on an auction platform in Savannah. She learned to read more confidently. She worked as a seamstress. She helped newly arrived fugitives adjust to freedom. She married a kind blacksmith named Samuel Richards and raised her children with a quiet determination that they would understand exactly what had been fought for on their behalf. But she never forgot. Not Elias Cartwright, not Thornton Graves, and not the women whose names she had read in Abigail's journal: Rachel, Margaret, and the others whose names had been lost. She often wondered what had happened to them, whether anyone would ever know, whether their disappearances would remain rumors whispered in kitchens and fields, never acknowledged by the world that allowed it to happen. The answer came 14 years later. In 1863, during the middle of the Civil War, Union forces pushed into Savannah and the surrounding areas of Savannah. Plantation owners fled ahead of the advance, abandoning homes, fields, and the people they had enslaved. Thornton Graves was among them. He left in a hurry, traveling south with what valuables he could carry, leaving the plantation that had hidden his crimes behind. A regiment of Union soldiers, many of them formerly enslaved men now wearing blue uniforms, were stationed temporarily on Graves's property. One of those soldiers was a sergeant named Isaiah Freeman. Freeman had escaped slavery in Alabama 3 years earlier. He had joined the Union Army not just to fight the Confederacy, but to fight the system that had once claimed ownership over his life. On a warm afternoon, while exploring the grounds, Freeman walked toward the old tobacco barn at the edge of the north field. The structure was weathered and quiet, its doors hanging slightly crooked on rusted hinges. Something about it caught his attention. Perhaps it was the isolation. Perhaps it was the way the ground around it looked slightly disturbed, as though it had been dug and refilled more than once. Inside, the air was stale. The wooden floorboards creaked under his boots. In the far corner, he noticed something odd. Several planks looked newer than the others. Freeman crouched down and pried one loose with the tip of his bayonet. Beneath the floor was empty space. A hidden cellar. He called for help, and together with 2 other soldiers, he lifted the planks away. The smell hit them first. Then they saw the shapes. Wrapped in rotting canvas, buried in shallow earth. Human remains. Adult skeletons, their bones fragile and scattered, and beside them, much smaller remains. Infants. Freeman staggered back, his stomach turning. He had seen death in battle. He had seen men blown apart by cannon fire. But this was different. This was quiet, deliberate, hidden. The discovery was reported to his commanding officer, Captain Henry Clark from Massachusetts. Clark arrived with a notebook and several enlisted men. They carefully uncovered the remains, documenting what they found. 8 women, 8 infants. All buried beneath the floor of a barn no one was allowed near. Clark ordered formerly enslaved people from the plantation to be brought forward for questioning. Their testimonies matched the whispers that had circulated for years. Yes, Graves had purchased pregnant women at auction. Yes, he kept them isolated in the barn. Yes, they disappeared within months. Yes, sometimes the sound of babies crying could be heard at night. Clark wrote everything down. He intended to publish the report as evidence of the barbarity of slavery, as proof that the system did not simply exploit people, but allowed monsters to operate without consequence. But war has a way of burying even the most horrifying discoveries. Military priorities shifted. Battles demanded attention. Paperwork was filed away. Thornton Graves was never captured. He died in 1867 in Mississippi under an assumed name, having escaped justice entirely. The women beneath the barn remained nameless. The report remained forgotten. For decades, it sat in military archives, occasionally glanced at by historians, but never brought into the public eye. Then, in 1931, a graduate student at Emory University named Patricia Whitmore stumbled upon it while researching slavery in coastal Georgia. She read Captain Clark's report and realized what she was holding. Proof of systematic murder. Evidence of crimes that had never been acknowledged. She prepared an article for publication, determined to bring the story to light. But before it could be printed, she received a visit. A lawyer representing the Graves family. They were still prominent citizens in Savannah. They made it clear that publication would result in legal action. Patricia was young. She did not have the resources for a prolonged legal fight. She withdrew the article. But she did not destroy her research. She sealed copies of the documents in an envelope and left instructions that it was not to be opened until 50 years after her death. Patricia Whitmore died in 1974. In 2024, the envelope was opened. The contents were donated to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where the report now sits, available for researchers. The names of the women are still unknown, but their existence is no longer rumor. Meanwhile, long before the report resurfaced, Danina had been writing her own record. For over 40 years, she kept a journal. She wrote about Charleston, about Ruth, about the auction in Savannah, about Jacob Marsh and the cabin in the woods, about the ship and the storm and the moment her foot touched Canadian soil. She wrote so that no one could ever claim people like her had not suffered. She wrote so that no one could ever soften the truth into something comfortable. On the final page of her journal, written just weeks before her death in 1891, she left a message. She wrote, "I was sold for 19 cents because the man who owned me wanted me to believe I was worthless. But I was never worthless. No human being is worthless. I survived because others believed this and risked everything to prove it." Danina died at 64, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had never known slavery. She was buried in Dawn, Ontario, in soil that had never recognized her as property. Thornton Graves's plantation changed hands many times after the war. In 1921, The land was purchased by a black farming cooperative made up of formerly enslaved people and their descendants. They farmed the land for decades, unaware of what had once been buried there. In 1968, while plowing near where the barn had stood, members of the cooperative uncovered bones that had been missed in the original excavation. The remains were reburied in a cemetery in Savannah beneath a simple marker that reads, "Victims of Slavery, 1843 to 1862. It is not enough. It never could be. But it is something. A quiet acknowledgement that these women existed, that they mattered, that they were not lost completely to the silence Thornton Graves had tried to bury them in." Danina's story survived because she told it. Because people like Jacob Brennan, Sarah, Hannah, Thomas Garrett, Frederick Douglass, and dozens of unnamed helpers believed her life had value. Because someone pried up a floorboard in 1863 and looked beneath. Because someone in 1931 refused to forget what they had read. She was sold for 19 cents. But her story outlived the men who tried to erase her. On a warm morning in November of 1849, a pregnant young woman stood on an auction platform in Savannah and was offered for sale at a price so low the crowd thought it had to be a mistake. 19 cents. They assumed she was worthless. They assumed she was broken. They assumed no one would want her. What they did not know was that the price had been set with terrible intention. It was meant to send her into the hands of a man whose plantation had already swallowed 7 pregnant women without a trace. What they did not expect was a stranger willing to pay $1,200 to stop that from happening. That single moment on an auction block changed the course of her life. It led to a hidden cabin in the woods, a journal that exposed a pattern of horror, a desperate escape in the cargo hold of a ship during a violent storm, a journey along the Underground Railroad, guided by brave men and women who risked everything. And finally, a crossing into Canada where she would give birth to a free child and begin a life no one could ever own again. Years later, Union soldiers would uncover the truth buried beneath a barn floor on Thornton Graves's plantation. Proof that the whispers had been real. Proof that the system of slavery had protected not only exploitation, but murder. And decades after that, forgotten documents and a woman's careful journal would bring the story back into the light. She was sold for 19 cents. But her story proved she was never worthless. Her survival, her courage, and the courage of those who helped her outlived the men who tried to erase her. Follow this channel for more hidden stories waiting to be remembered.